All right. Well, welcome, y'all. For how many people is this the first conference you're back to in person since the pandemic? Bunch of us, yeah. Okay, very good. Welcome back. Well, this is not my first, but this conference is a beloved one, so I'm glad we get to come back here. So we're going to be talking about developer security essentials, or how to improve security without becoming a security professional. How many of y'all are developers? Nice. Any security professionals in the room? Excellent. Please interrupt me and critique me and tell me everything I'm doing wrong. I can take it. Yeah, that's awesome. And I'm just curious about language. We have any dedicated Java programmers here? Nice. My people. I am also. How about JavaScript? All right, very good. Me too. How about C# or .NET? Excellent. Python? Great. Ruby? Huzzah. PHP? We won't hold it against you. Just kidding. I love PHP. What'd I miss? Anything? C++. Hooray! Excellent. I will admit that I have never professionally programmed C++, but I did a lot of C programming. Oh, yeah. Okay. So, why is this not working? All right. There we go. All right. So, my name is Micah Silverman. I work for Snyk. I'm a Java developer. I have been since it was released in 1995. This is usually when I like to say, get off my lawn. To all you young whippersnappers, I got to co-author this book, Mastering Enterprise Java Beans, just in time for that technology to be irrelevant, but it's something I'm still very proud of. I contribute to open source projects. How many people contribute to open source projects? One commit ever on an open source project. Nice. Everybody participate in Hacktoberfest? Some of us? Yeah? I missed it this year. First time in a while. Boo. I am a chapter leader for DevSecCon. If you have no idea what that is, it's a standalone organization that Snyk, the company I work for, supports a lot, but it's its own thing. We have competitors do talks at DevSecCon, and it brings together developers, security professionals, DevOps people, and we have meetups all over the world. I started the first chapter in the US in Virginia, and now we have another U.S. chapter on the West Coast in the Bay Area. But the cool thing about DevSecCon is that all of our meetups are always hybrid, even since before the pandemic. So you can drop in on a meetup in Germany and see what they're talking about there. And they're often in English, sometimes in other languages, but very cool organization. I like to build these freestanding, standalone arcade machines. Anybody ever hear of MAME? Yeah. So I like to build these big machines. And finally, and most importantly, about what to know about me is that I am a chaotic neutral in Dungeons and Dragons. What that means, if you're not familiar with it, is that I like to mess around with people and systems. I like to poke around the edges of things. I like to find where these vulnerabilities are. In the context of D&D, it means maybe we're walking through a forest and for no good reason I trip one of my teammates. That's not cool, but it's hilarious. But it turns out that this alignment is super useful in the realm of security and hacking, because sometimes it requires a little thinking outside the box, like how can I kind of get my way into this system? But the neutral part is that I don't cause any real harm. I don't cause any damage. As a security professional, I report vulnerabilities that I find appropriately and discreetly and go through that process. That is why I'm not chaotic evil. So in the context of developers and security, what are the challenges that we face? Well, if you're like me and you've been around for a long time, software delivery is almost certainly sped up for you. Back in, let's say, the early aughts, even surprisingly deep into the early aughts, I did consulting work for big banks and insurance companies, and our release cycle was like once a quarter at best. So we'd plan and plan and plan and work and work and work, and then we had this small window to deploy. It was like 3 days, and it was 100% over a weekend. It was like Thursday to Sunday. That was our deploy window. And if we missed that window, we had to get a pile of exceptions, and it had to run up the chain, and it was really bad. And what would also often happen is maybe in the last week of this 90 days of work, we'd shoot over the work that we'd done to the security team, the siloed standalone security team, and then we'd get stuff kicked back, and then we had to scramble around. So the good news is that software delivery has sped up quite a bit. That really is good news. We work in tighter units of work. We have test suites. We have all these things that we didn't for a long time, but very little thought has been given to security. Maybe you've had that experience too. And there's kind of a lack of security focus throughout the app lifecycle. Often it's still an afterthought. And I like to relate this to the experience with test suites, because there was a time, it's hard to imagine, but there was a time when us developers resisted the very idea of having test suites in our apps. And we would say, I'm too busy. I got to deliver features. I can't spend all this time developing tests. We have a QA department for that. They'll point and click and make sure everything's okay. There was that time. And now we can't imagine a CI/CD pipeline without running our test suite. And if something happens that passes a certain threshold, we fail the build, we get notified, and we have to deal with it. Well, the punchline to this whole thing is we want to bring that dynamic to the development lifecycle for security. So if our CI/CD pipeline runs a security scan and a critical vulnerability pops up, well, we probably shouldn't deploy that to production. We should probably be notified and address that in some way. So we want to get away from this siloed security expertise, but without developers having to take on a whole new role, without them having, we're not saying all developers should go out and get their CISSP and join a red team and do penetration testing. We have enough to do, security people have enough to do, but it would be super awesome if we could start to catch this stuff earlier in the life cycle when it's less expensive to deal with it. Me sitting in front of my computer running a security scan on the open source library I just decided to use and finding out that it has vulnerabilities and maybe switching to a different library is a lot cheaper than about to deploy to production and the security team kicks it back and we've written all this code against this library that we chose to use and now we got to scramble. And of course the biggest challenge is that customer data could be compromised. That's the big hairy evil North Star, is when security issues do make it into production and then they can get exploited. All right, enough talk. Let's hack. I'll leave this up for a minute and I'll highlight the URL. You can just go to it or you can grab that QR code. But there's an application called Snyk-chat-goof. We have a lot of these goof applications, we call them. We have this GitHub organization called Snyk Labs, and we have a lot of these goof repos there. And the whole reason we call them goof is because we would never want somebody to mistake them for being anywhere near production code because they are purposely vulnerable. All right, Snyk-chat-goof, and we'll come back to that. Let me jump over to here. Right, so you should see a shockingly simple interface like this. I am not a UX or a UI person, so don't hold this against me, but this is a useful demonstration here. All right, anybody having trouble getting here that wants to? Yeah. All right. Good? Cool. All right, so you're going to come to an interface like this. Let me make this just a little bit bigger. And put in a username. Doesn't have to be your real name. Doesn't matter. Oh, look. Some of you have already created rooms. Excellent. I applaud you. But come over to the main room and start chatting because that's where we'll see everybody. Now, some of you are ahead of the game, and I appreciate that. And like I said, there is a special prize for anybody that can crash this app, but there are some ground rules. No denial of service attacks. This is a very lean, light, small instance running in Heroku, and you could probably overrun it from your phone if you really tried. So no denial of service attacks. But if you can do some tricky JavaScript or some tricky back-end API work that brings this app down, I have a special prize for you. Now, actually I'm going to make this a little bit smaller. Not that small, not that big. All right, that'll have to do. Couple other things about this. So what are we looking at? This is a JavaScript front end. It happens to be using Vue.js. It's a Spring Boot back end, which is Java. And it uses WebSockets to communicate so that when we type messages, like a bunch of you are already doing, we all see it. So I just said hello, a bunch of people joined, right? So we get these alerts. I love that people are trying to inject JavaScript. Keep doing that. That's awesome. That's totally in bounds. And some of you have already done this, but if you're like me, the very first thing that I try to do as a chaotic neutral is see if there's any sort of sanitization at all. So I'm going to try and send a message like this. I would be very surprised if on any sort of modern app this worked, but this is really low-hanging fruit, so why not try here? And you'll notice that when I send that through, I got to scroll a little bit. Bear with me. Where did that end up? You all are typing fast. Well, let me see. Oh, did somebody break it? No, somebody just tried to put in a really long bit of text, but it does clip it. Let me try this once more because I lost it. It scrolled by too quick, I think. Nobody panic. We just call this the demo monster. There we go. Okay, so what this tells me is that there is some level of sanitization because it didn't push this through as a tag to be interpreted by the browser. It converted it to plain text and displayed exactly what I typed because there is some level of sanitization. Awesome. But we're not done trying to break this thing just yet. You're the Prince of Oman. All right, very good. Nasty Nork, I like it. Grant all on schema, great. I will tell you, I love all the database stuff. I will tell you there's no database of any kind in this application at all, but feel free to keep trying to drop tables. All right, now what I didn't tell you is that this app supports Markdown. Who knows what Markdown is? Yeah, most of us. So Markdown is kind of this terse markup language that allows us to get some extra style and format through, and this is a nice thing to have in a chat app, right? So all I have to do is put a pound symbol in front of my text, and now it's big. That's nice, and I can do things like bold and underline and italicize. So if you imagine the development process for this chat app, I built the whole chat app. It's going good, excellent. I like that people know how to drop in images. Let's keep it SFW, please. It doesn't count as crashing the app if you start dropping in NSFW pictures. But you can imagine over the development life cycle of this app that I might want to layer in Markdown support because now we can do things like show images, and that's a nice experience. Now, once I know that it supports Markdown, well, that gives me a whole new vector to mess around with this because Markdown supports links. Right, so this is a perfectly valid Markdown link, a set of square brackets with a label, followed by a set of parens with the URL. And one thing I will warn you is that there isn't support in Markdown for opening a new tab. So if you click this link, it's going to take you away from the chat. You can just come back, or you can right-click and open link in a new tab, and you can see it's just an ordinary link. Well, that's super useful for chatting, but it also offers me a new vector of attack. So I'm going to try to get sneaky now and see if I can't inject JavaScript another way. So again, this is valid Markdown, but instead of URL, I'm hoping that this sneaks past the sanitizer, and now JavaScript alert 1 will get converted into the href part of my anchor tag, and that will trigger the JavaScript engine if it goes through. So let's see. So now if you notice, the only thing that came through is a closed paren. Now most of the people in my life, or many of the people in my life, it looks like Zero Cool maybe is on the right track there. Many people might say, well, this didn't work, I'm gonna give up. For me as a chaotic neutral, this means progress. Because the sanitizer didn't just pass it through exactly as I typed it the way it did with the tag. It kind of broke or gave up or did something weird, and all I got was the closing paren. So I think I've made some kind of progress here. So I'm gonna try a technique here that you may or may not be familiar with, and I'll explain it in just a moment. I think I have this right. Let's see if I get it right on the first shot. All right, who knows what I just added to this? Anybody know what this kind of formatting is called? I heard something, but I didn't hear it clearly. ASCII? Yeah, well, the number is an ASCII reference, but these are called HTML entities. So ampersand pound followed by an ASCII reference number followed by a semicolon, that's an HTML entity. And in fact, that's kind of what's going on behind the scenes when it takes a tag and renders it as text. Because the browser will convert it to the character and then will not necessarily interpret it as a tag depending on the sanitizer. So what I'm hoping is that the sanitizer is kind of dumb. Maybe the sanitizer is specifically looking for JavaScript : and this will sneak past the sanitizer. Then the browser will interpret ampersand pound 58 semicolon as a colon, drop it in, and then maybe this inner HTML or this inner reference will be interpreted as JavaScript. So the order of operations is that the browser is going to convert this to a colon first, and then processing will continue. So maybe I can sneak this past the sanitizer. I'm imagining that the sanitizer is like a regular expression, and you may have heard this joke. If you have a problem and you use regular expressions to try to solve it, now you have two problems. So maybe this will sneak past the sanitizer. Well, now if you notice, we get nothing. It's like the sanitizer just gave up. Didn't know what to do with this, and it just stopped or broke. I don't know exactly what's going on behind the scenes, but I think I'm getting warmer here. I think I'm close because now it just gave up altogether and nothing came through. So I'm going to do one last thing, and this is a little bit of a spoiler alert because this is going to work, but let's talk about why this is going to work. The reason that this little hack works is a combination of browsers, modern browsers, any browser being too permissive, and a security vulnerability in the open source library that I'm using here. So let's first talk about the browser being too permissive. Well, ampersand pound 58 is not a valid HTML entity. It's missing the semicolon, but your browser will still happily convert that into a colon. Now, if you work in a strongly typed language like Java or C#, you know that if you forget a semicolon somewhere, it's going to blow up on you. And you know, at least for me, I'm glad that it does that. It kind of saves me from myself. The browser, not so much. It's kind of YOLOing it out there, whatever. Close enough. We'll make this a colon. Now, this is combined with a vulnerability in the Markdown library that I'm using, which we're going to look at in a second. And so if this sneaks past the sanitizer, what we're going to be left with is JavaScript : this. Well, this is a keyword in JavaScript. It's often misunderstood. It's not so misunderstood in Java, but it's often misunderstood in JavaScript. There, I said it. But it's perfectly valid. It's just a no-op. Nothing will happen. It's syntactically fine. Then we have a semicolon, which is the statement separator in JavaScript. And then we have an alert and a 1. And just for good measure, I put in the HTML entity for the closing paren, just in case there's some kind of paren matching in the sanitizer. I don't know if there is or there isn't. But just for safety, let's see if I got this right. I think I got this right. Let's see what American did here. American, very good. I think you got it right too. Yeah, nice. So now when you click on this link, you get an alert 1, right? Now, that may be anticlimactic, but there's a couple things that are worth pointing out here. First of all, this is not a typical cross-site scripting attack where I've kind of hacked the app running on my own machine. It's impacted all of you, too. If any of you click on this link through the magic of WebSockets, you now have this cross-site scripting attack introduced by way of me and Mr. or Mrs. American out there. So it's worse than that, and also you might be inclined to say, well, big deal, it's just an alert, not that big a deal, but for those of you that have ever played around in Capture the Flag events, I'm running one tomorrow, by the way, shameless plug, you know that attackers want to get a foot in the door, and then once you have a foot in the door, then you start to expand and do something more creative. So maybe now that I have a foot in the door where I can inject JavaScript, maybe now I'll try to exfiltrate your local storage, or I'll try to get all of your cookies to display on the screen in a way that I can copy and paste them and maybe take over a session of yours or something like that. So this is bad. So now as a developer, I want to be able to move fast. I want to be able to choose open source libraries, and I want to have a high degree of confidence that I can trust those open source libraries and that they're not going to come back to bite me. And I'll show you here, when we look at the code, this is me trying to be a responsible developer. I picked an open source library called Marked. And in 3 lines of code, I added Markdown support to my chat app. That's pretty good. That's a pretty good trade-off from a development perspective. I imported the marked library. I set up some options because I read the documentation. I know that the sanitizer isn't on by default, and I want sanitization, of course. So I turn on the sanitizer, and then up here, anytime a message comes in over the WebSocket, I want to pass it into the marked function so that if there is markdown in it, it gets properly rendered on the screen. So for 3 lines of code, this is pretty good. This is a great benefit from a development perspective, but we just saw that it's not great from a security perspective. So what are we going to do about that? Well, the first thing I want to introduce you to is a tool called Snyk Advisor. And this is totally free, as in you don't even have to put in an email address. You don't have to have a Snyk account. You don't have to put in any information to start using it. And what it does is it gives a package health score to open source libraries that you might want to use. And you can search on library names. You can search on free-form text. So I did a search for Markdown, and especially in the world of JavaScript, you'll notice a whole bunch of stuff came back. And on the right-hand side, we have this package health score. And if I start to scroll around, only one of them has 100 out of 100. So that's a pretty natural choice. If I'm making a decision on an open source library, I'm going to choose that one. Now, if you're thinking, well, didn't we just show that there's a cross-site scripting error? The answer is yes. Good thinking. Put a pin in that. The short story there is that I cheated. But the latest version of the marked library gets 100 out of 100. How do we derive this score? Well, if you look here on the right, we're looking at 4 dimensions. Now, if you're like me, in the past, when I was deciding on an open source library to use, I would go to GitHub and I'd look at the number of stars, I'd look at the number of contributors, I'd look at the last commit or the last release, and that kind of covers the bottom 3 dimensions here: popularity, maintenance, community. But what I didn't have really good feedback on was security. And so I can see here that the latest version of the marked library has 0 known vulnerabilities. We also identify what's the most popular version of the library, and sometimes that can be really informative. In this case, the most popular version is 4.1.1. Not surprising, because 4.2.0 was literally just released. Actually, it says 10.22, so it was released very recently. But sometimes you'll see that the most popular version of a library actually has vulnerabilities in it. And that's kind of unfortunately, a not too uncommon scenario. Contributors to open source projects will frequently patch and take care of security issues, and then there's a big lag for when people go and get the latest version and update it so that they don't have those security vulnerabilities. And that's kind of when attackers go to work. When there's a known issue and a patch has been made, attackers kind of go to work to probe around the edges and see if maybe you're using an older version that has these issues with it. So the answer to the question is of how did we get into this boat where there's a cross-site scripting attack is because I cheated, and the version of marked that I'm using is extraordinarily old. It's 0.3.5. It's from 2015. It was before their 1.0 release. So not surprisingly, it's got some issues with it. So I totally cheated, but the latest version does not have any vulnerabilities at all, let alone, or I should say any known vulnerabilities, let alone this cross-site scripting business. All right. Now, one other thing I want to demo for you here before we get down to some more business, and by the way, I'm going to wrap up this talk with a kind of a walkthrough of how you can engage with our developer challenge. If you went by the Snyk booth, we have this developer challenge up, and all you have to do is go and fork a repo. It's got to be a public GitHub repo. It can be your own or somebody else's, doesn't matter. Register it with the game, scan it for vulnerabilities, fix something, and then you get points. And the top point getters get an Ardu Boy. Anybody know what an Ardu Boy is? Nobody? It's like this little credit card size game platform. It kind of looks like a Game Boy, an old school Nintendo Game Boy, but it's very small and it's very hackable and it's a lot of fun. That's what we're giving away to the top 2 point getters. But that being said, What I'm showing here on the lower left, this is an IDE integration. We happen to be looking at IntelliJ, but there are Snyk IDE integrations for Visual Studio Code, Visual Studio, PyCharm, like pretty much any modern IDE that you'd use. And the nice thing is that I don't have to wait for it to get to my CI/CD server to be scanned. I can scan as I'm going, and I can look at my own custom code. I can look at my open source dependencies to get kind of a lay of the land of where I might have vulnerabilities. Now, as I said, these repos are purposely vulnerable. And by the way, this is kind of a complex project. The POM XML is the Java side of things. The package JSON is the JavaScript side of things, and they both get scanned. And here you can see that, it's coming up with a lot of complaints about this version of Mark that I'm using. So this is kind of super handy to work with as you go. And if I want to get an overall summary, if I hang my mouse over here, it's going to tell me that if I upgrade to marked 4.0.10, then all of the vulnerabilities associated with marked go away. Now, I just showed you a moment ago that the latest version of marked is 4.2.0 or 4.2.2. I forgot what it said there. But the reason I'm bringing that up is because it's kind of a subtle thing, but Snyk will not necessarily recommend that you upgrade to the latest version. It'll recommend that you upgrade to the version closest to the one you're currently using that gets rid of all the vulnerabilities. Now, this is kind of an extreme case because I'm using such an old version, but usually we try to get you to the closest version that gets rid of the vulnerabilities so that you won't have breaking changes. Usually it's like a patch version, or at worst a minor version update, and then you have a higher degree of confidence that you're not going to have breaking changes. You'll still want to run your test suite, of course, and go through all that. All right. So we love this iceberg metaphor. Maybe you've seen it before, but it turns out that it maps onto application security really nicely, because with what we know about icebergs, the tip of the iceberg is the smallest part of an iceberg. And it turns out that in a modern application, something like 10 to 20% of your code is custom. The rest of your code is not custom. Well, what is it? It's open source dependencies, it's configuration files like Docker files and Terraform configuration files. All of that goes into being what we call your application, but only 10 to 20% of your code is custom code in most modern applications. 80 to 90% of your code base is going to be open source dependencies. And for the most part, that's a really good thing. There are companies, probably Snyk is one of them, that wouldn't even exist without open source. So as a developer, as an engineer on teams, I've gained a great benefit from open source, which is why I like to contribute back to open source, and maybe you have also. But here's the thing. 80% of the security vulnerabilities that we find in our research come from transitive dependencies or dependencies of dependencies. So marked itself isn't necessarily the problem, but maybe marked has a handful of its own dependencies, and something like 80% of the security vulnerabilities are going to come from those dependencies. So even if you're contributing to open source projects, even if you're intimately familiar with a library like marked, there's no way that we can be, totally in depth with all of the transitive dependencies. So we need a way to identify these security vulnerabilities, especially when we're talking about a typical application. The average application across languages has a total of something like 80 dependencies. So maybe you've brought in 5 direct dependencies, but then when you blow out that tree of all the transitive dependencies, it ends up being something like 80. Now, as we work our way down the iceberg and there's kind of less and less visible, we have things like containers where let's imagine a scenario where I've driven all of the vulnerabilities out of my custom code, out of my dependencies, no more vulnerabilities, 0. But now I deploy it to a Docker container that's running an old version of Linux, or it's running a newer version of Linux, but in that Docker container I have a bunch of utilities that are vulnerable. So it kind of expands our surface area of attack. The general wisdom is you want to run the leanest Docker image that you can that will run your application. And you want to be careful to not go about installing for the classic examples is maybe your Docker file just does an npm install, and it'll install all of the dev dependencies from the package JSON. Well, if those dev dependencies aren't installed at all in your runtime environment, then that shrinks the surface area of attack because they're not even there to be exploited. So you want to make them as lean as possible. And then infrastructure as code is kind of like, from a security concern perspective, it's like containers on steroids. Now, maybe I have this vulnerable container definition, and now I'm going to spin up 1,000 of those instances, and they're all going to be networked, and they're all running as root. And so as identified by the NSA, the #1 cloud vulnerability is misconfiguration in these files that do such powerful things. You know, in 10 lines of Terraform, I might fire up 1,000 instances of something or other inside of a cluster. So, a couple quick plugs for Snyk, and then we're going to switch over to the developer challenge. Snyk has 4 products. I showed you some of them. Snyk Code looks at your code and identifies vulnerabilities in your custom code. Open source is what we were looking at, where it found the vulnerabilities in the marked library, for instance. Container and IAC, those look at those configuration files for those technologies, and it'll look at your Docker images, for instance, inside the binary of your image and give you report back on known vulnerabilities. And the big punchline here is that we want security to be a concern throughout the software development lifecycle, much the way that testing kind of naturally is. I run my test suite locally before I commit, and I also know that at my CI/CD pipeline, that test suite is going to be run again, and if anything fails, maybe the build will break. And then especially important is in production to have active monitoring. So how many people were involved or even heard about the Log4Shell incident in December of 2021? Most of us, right? Even if you're not a Java developer, you probably heard about it because on December 9th of 2021, everything was fine with the world, and December 10th, all of a sudden everything was on fire. Now, not a line of production code may have changed, but as often happens, a new vulnerability was discovered and disclosed. And in the case of Log4Shell, it was a big one. Everybody had to, kind of run around and get this patched. Now, if you were a Snyk customer on December 10th, and you had Java production code that was using Log4j, you would have received a notification that there's a new, level 10 hair on fire vulnerability that you have to deal with. Excuse me. Okay, let's talk about the developer challenge in our last 10 minutes together. I want to help you get a leg up on the developer challenge. And the cool thing about it is that we have all these languages supported. It can be any kind of layer of the iceberg. If you're a Docker person, if you know Terraform really well, you can play this game. If you're JavaScript or Java, you can play this game. Now, the only rules is that it's got to be on GitHub and it's got to be public. So that's not a limitation of Snyk, it's a limitation of the game. And by the way, you don't need Snyk at all to play this game. You don't have to have a Snyk account, but I would assert that Snyk will help you find these issues quicker. And ideally, you'd find an open source project that you already contribute to or are interested in contributing to and maybe make a real difference. So you could both score points in the game as well as putting up a real PR that gets merged into an open source project and actually solve a vulnerability. Now you can also go to the GitHub Snyk-labs org and pick any goof repository. That's going to have a ton of vulnerabilities. So if you go and fork that repository, run a scan and see all the vulnerabilities and just fix something like bumping a version of marked from 0.35 to 4.0.10, you'll get points in the game also. All right, so let's jump over there and just take a look. And I'm going to do this all in the browser. You can do this wherever you work. You can do it in your IDE. You can do it from the command line. But if you just want to play the game and check it out and get some points on the board, you can do it all from your browser. So that's what I'm going to demonstrate. And where I'm going to start is I have forked the Snyk chat goof. Let me go to the original place first just so you can see it in case you're interested in doing the same. It's Snyk labs Snyk dash chat dash goof. I'll highlight this in just a second. Let's see if I got it right. There we go. Right, so this is publicly available. All these goof apps are in the Snyk Labs org. And so the first thing I did was I made a fork of it. Well, I'm going to go and, looks like I didn't bring this up. So let's go to play.snyk-challenge. Okay, and this is the interface that you're going to see. I'll make this big. And all you have to do is enter an email address. Honestly, it doesn't even have to be a real email address. We just hang on to a hashed version of whatever you type in for the email address for uniqueness. And then if the demo monster doesn't bite me, it'll say that you're ready to fix vulnerabilities, and you'll have a little unique tag next to your alias there. And then the next thing you can do is go and import a repo into the game. So dog-eared and chat goof is what I called it, right? So you put in your username, you put in a repo name, and that's going to kick off an import. Now, depending on the size of the project, it might take a minute. You'll notice that the interface here is kind of locked while the spinny thing is going around there. You just want to wait for it to import. What it's doing is it's importing this project into the game, and behind the scenes it's using Snyk to do an initial scan, and it's going to report back in just a moment how many vulnerabilities are in this project. So that's like the baseline. Then we're going to go fix an issue, and then if I can pull it off, we'll see it actually update and get some points on the board. But that's the whole game. You import a project, it's done. Let me jump back. So it finished importing. It's telling me that I have critical, high, medium, and low vulnerabilities. That's my baseline. Now, if I fix any of them, I'm going to get some points in the game. So let me jump back over to here, and I'm going to do this all from within GitHub. I'm just going to go over to my package.json, and I'm going to update this to, oh, I got to edit it. Can I edit it? Am I logged in? I am logged in. Demo monster. Hello. I wonder why it's grayed out. Hold, please. Who owns this repo? Oh, I guess it would help if I signed in. No wonder why the demo monster is biting us. Bear with me a second. Come on, 1Password. Don't be a jerk. All right, first deep bite of the demo monster. Let's see. All right, let's go to GitHub. You can see all of my favorite accounts here. We got that. We got that. We want to use that. No, still hating us. Almost there. Ooh, will I make it in time? Let's see. Haha. Okay. One more time. Now, just like I said, I'm going to go and edit the package JSON in place. This is maybe not the easiest or best way to code, but I'm going to go 4.0. I'll just do 4.1.1 because it's one that I remember. I'll give it a commit message. Updated, marked. Okay, now if you're playing the game, you don't have to do anything else. I've made the change. I've pushed up the change. In this case, I made it in place. And eventually, the game is going to swing back around and rescore. So everybody remember 1774. Was that what it was before? No, I think it already rescored maybe. Let's see if it was that quick. No, it doesn't look like it did it yet. Okay, so I'm going to show you my little cheat screen really quick, and then we'll wrap up. If 1Password would stop being a jerk. Why is this not working? All right, bear with me a second here, y'all. Because what I'm going to show you is something you ordinarily wouldn't see, but it's how I can kick off it's how I can force a score update. Where is it? Micah plus Snyk, where are you? It's like watching paint dry for you poor people. All right, new plan. Nobody panic. We can do this. I bet that it will work over here. Snyk, challenge. Will one password work here? No, of course not. Why would it? Fine. Haha. There we go. All right, now we're talking. Demo monster is going to be defeated. All right, so all I'm going to do, again, this is not something you'd ordinarily see. I have a cron job. It runs every 20 minutes or so. It re-imports projects. It updates scores. We're just going to run this manually so that we can see that my score has made it to the leaderboard. All right, let's update all scores. Come on, score. You can do it. In the meantime, I'm just kind of curious to see if anybody is on the... Oh, yeah, we got some people on the scoreboard. Okay. Let's go back to the top here. Yeah, all right, not bad. It's taking its sweet time. Sorry for watching the paint dry. This is what happens in live demos. Of course, I can't see which org is mine because it's a hashed version of the email, but it'll get there eventually. Anyway, point is, at some point, I'm going to have some score on this scoreboard, and you can too by going to fix some open source projects. Okay, now, if you notice, in what I did there, I didn't use Snyk at all, but the reason that I knew to update the version of marked was because I had previously used Snyk. So you can, if you want to work with a project and you don't feel like installing the Snyk tools directly onto your machine, you can actually import it directly into your Snyk account. So you can create a free Snyk account, free forever, etc., etc. Just has some limits on scans. And if I look at chat goof, so it's connected to your GitHub. I can go and import it directly into the browser, and then it's going to do a scan and give you that vulnerability report that we saw earlier, although it's not quite done yet. Last thing, and then I release you to your day. Right, so you can see here 1774, that actually is updated. One of these was 11 before. But anyway, you can see it right in the browser, so it's kind of your choice. You don't have to use Snyk at all, or you can. Let it give you a leg up. And let's see if I got any points on the board while I was stalling for time. Doesn't look like I did yet. All right, well, anyway, I hope you'll play. I hope you win. Feel free to swing by the booth and get one of these awesome shirts. It's our little mascot patch with the wrench in the mouth. And I'll release you today. I'm here for questions. Thank you very much.